This is an article published in the Russian media and might as well be from a Kremlin bot or a Putin's agent, but let's see what it says. Hidden history of Russia and US relationships. How Russian ships defended New York and San Francisco. Published on December 11, 2018. When in 1775 King George III turned to Catherine II for military assistance, asking her to help pacify the American rebels and send Russian troops numbering 20-30,000 soldiers and officers to the New World, the Empress refused this request. Catherine was well aware that war in North America seriously weakened England, and the separation of North American states dealt a colossal blow to the economy and military power of the British Crown. All attempts by British diplomats to influence Catherine II and get her to make a favorable decision to send Russian troops overseas did not lead to the desired result. And now, what do we see? 20,000 NATO troops fighting in Russian-Ukraine conflict against Russia. 20,000 and 20,000 again. 200 years fast forward. The Empress firmly decided not to interfere in the conflict, especially on the side of Great Britain. Although, of course, quite neutral arguments were used for the refusal, they spoke about the excessive costs of sending troops overseas for the Russian treasury. Having been refused by Catherine, the British authorities tried to hire troops from the Princess of Germany, but this idea was also not successful. Overseas, the British suffered defeat after defeat, and the American colonists managed to get help from France, which was interested in weakening its competitor, England. French volunteers, including aristocratic officers, went to fight for the freedom of the North American states. A report of Russian diplomats to Catherine. The further deterioration of the military and political position of England in Europe forced the British authorities to again turn to Catherine II for help. And again the Russian Empress refused, although British diplomats offered Russia a full-fledged military alliance. Meanwhile, information that Catherine refused to comply with London's request was received very positively by the North American rebels. We are quite pleased to learn from a reliable source that the requests and the proposals of Great Britain to the Russian Empress are rejected with contempt, George Washington wrote in a letter to Lafayette in the spring of 1779. At the same time, Washington noticed that the Russian government, refusing to help England in suppressing the American uprising, was acting in the interest of the rights of mankind. In fact, Catherine and her entourage were guided, of course, by the national interest of Russia as a state and not by human rights and freedoms. For the Russian Empire to cooperate with England was not profitable and uninteresting. Catherine was well aware that England is a true and fierce enemy of Russia, which today offers an alliance and tomorrow it will stab in the back. Therefore, Petersburg did not satisfy the request of the London Royal Court. Against the background of the growing confrontation between the powers in continental Europe, the weakening of England played into the hands of the Russian Empire. In addition, a new white power of European civilization appeared, the states of North America, which at that time could ensure a change in the military political alignments in the world, not in favor of the British Crown. In the summer of 1779, Catherine II was presented with a secret report of the College of Foreign Affairs expressing the opinion of N.I. Panin, Vice-Chancellor I.A. Osterman and members of the secret expedition of the College of the Bakunin Brothers. Throughout the report, the line of guilt of England itself in the uprising in the American colonies was drawn. In addition, the report emphasized that the British government should not be trusted under any circumstances, and the activities of Great Britain on the seas were assessed very negatively. It was emphasized that the British now and then attacked the ships of other states, behaved very impudently. That is Jack the Sparrow. Jack the Sparrow, guys. It's cool. It's cool. Russian diplomats believed that the rejection of the American colonies from England would also make it possible to obtain great economic benefits. A quarrel with the colonies will free the British market from those goods that used to come from North America, and their place can be taken by goods from the Russian Empire. This is how the authors of the report argued, arguing the point of view on the need to refuse cooperation with London in the suppression of the American fighters for the independence. The report concluded that Russia should be guided solely by its own political and economic interests, not succumb to British requests, and adhere to a policy of strict neutrality in the conflict between England and the American colonies. Declaration of Armed Neutrality. On February 28, March 10, 1780, the Russian Empire adopted a declaration of armed neutrality, which significantly influenced the world political situation, primarily the rules of international maritime trade, including trade with the United States of North America. Other states of Europe joined the declaration, which made it possible to significantly normalize the situation at sea. British interests were again put to shame. Thanks to the adoption of the declaration, the rules for the international maritime trade of neutral powers during the war were established. In particular, ships of neutral states were given the opportunity to freely visit the ports of all belligerent powers. The property of belligerent powers on neutral ships was inviolable. Weapons, military supplies were recognized as a military contraband, which was forbidden to be transported. The Declaration of Armed Neutrality was highly praised by the leaders of the American independence movement, and there was nothing surprising in this, since thanks to the declaration the position of the United States improved significantly. After all, the declaration limited the naval dominance of Great Britain, created obstacles for the naval blockade of the American continent. Thus, the position of the Russian Empire allowed the American states to freely trade with the European powers. At the initiative of Catherine, the League of Armed Neutrality was created, which was joined by Sweden, Denmark, and the Netherlands. The U.S. Congress also declared solidarity with the position of the Russian Empire and tried to achieve the accession of the North American states to the League. For more than a century, the United States has been perceived in our country as one of the most important political and military adversaries and economic competitors. Indeed, in the 20th century, our country more than once had to face the interests of Washington and sometimes quite openly oppose them. Now the United States is also in a very difficult relationship with Russia. On the conscience of the American leadership are bloody wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, Syria and Libya, Yugoslavia and Ukraine. But a century and a half ago everything was a little different. The Americans asked God to bless Russia and hoped for power of the Russian fleet. Gideon Welles, Secretary of the Navy of the United States of America, even directly wrote in his diary, "God bless the Russians. It happened in those days when the ships of the Russian squadron arrived on the shores of North America. Their visit was agreed between the two states and aimed at demonstrating the military political support of the United States from the Russian Empire. Although by that time there were no allied obligations between Russia and the United States, relations between the two countries developed quite well throughout the 19th century. Let's start with the fact that in 1775, when an uprising broke out in North America against British colonial rule, the English King George III turned to the Russian Empress Catherine II with requests for help in the fight against the colonists. But Catherine II answered with a harsh refusal. Moreover, when the colonies declared their independence in 1776, The Russian Empire took a position of armed neutrality, which meant the actual moral support of the American colonies. In those years, Great Britain was already the main political opponent of the Russian Empire, and in St. Petersburg, those chose a very correct course of action: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Although the Russian authorities have never sympathized with Republican sentiments, an exception was made for North America. In the next century, the relations between Russia and the United States were also more or less prosperous. For example, Nicholas I invited American engineers for the technical modernization of the Russian Empire. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the U.S. presidential election, a representative of the U.S. Republican Party, known for his criticism of slavery. Although after winning the election, Lincoln significantly reduced his radicalism and began to consider the emancipation of slaves as a very distant goal, in the southern slave states his victory caused great discontent. The Southerners launched the process of withdrawing from the United States of America, which they could no longer accept in the North. Interestingly, at the time, Great Britain and France provided full support to the Southerners, and President Lincoln was portrayed by the European press exclusively in black. At that time, the European powers carried out a similar policy towards the Russian Empire. After all, the Crimean War had just ended, in which Russia fought against the combined forces of England, France, and the Ottoman Empire, and Sardinia, Italy. In London, they were very afraid of strengthening Russia's position in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and Central Asia, so they tried with all their might to undermine Russian power, supporting for this purpose both the Russian revolutionaries, the Polish National Liberation Movement, and the Caucasian Highlanders. So Abraham Lincoln was also shot by British agent, don't forget that. In 1863, the Polish uprising broke out in the western regions of the Russian Empire, which was supported by Great Britain. By this time, the Civil War was already in full swing in the United States, in which the British also supported the Southerners. It was this circumstance that forced both the Russian and American authorities to recall the old principle: the enemy of my enemy is my friend. In the current situation in St. Petersburg, they came up with a very interesting and creative idea, which was put forward by Grand Duke Constantine and Naval Minister Nikolai Krabbe. The Russian authorities have decided to use North American ports to accommodate Russian ships. In the event of aggravation of relations with Great Britain and France, even 5 or 6 Russian warships could paralyze the entire Atlantic trade. When the American authorities were informed of this Russian plan, they did not object. Washington was concerned about the build-up of the British naval presence in Canada. The American leadership did not rule out that the British increase the number of their ships in order to organize an invasion of the United States to support the Southerners. Therefore, in Washington, they figured that extra warships, albeit under Russian flags, would be extra support in a possible conflict with Britain. On June 25, 1863, Emperor Alexander II decided to send 2 squadrons to the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans to operate on the trade routes of Britain. The expedition of Russian ships to the United States was organized in the strictest secrecy, since St. Petersburg really did not want further problems with Great Britain and possible obstacles to the implementation of this plan. Rear Admiral Stepan Stepanovich Lisovsky, the head of the Kronstadt port, and then the naval attaché in the United States, who in 1861-1862 worked in North America, supervising the construction of ships for the Russian fleet. The squadron under the command of Lisovsky included the frigates Alexander Nevsky, commander-captain of the first rank Mikhail Yakovlevich Fedorovsky, Пересвет, Commander Captain Lieutenant Nikolai Vasilievich Kopytiv, Oslabla, Commander Captain of the first rank Ivan Ivanovich Butakov, Corvettes, Varyak, Commander Lieutenant Commander Robert Alexandrovich Lund, and Vityaz, Commander Lieutenant Commander Oscar Karlovich Kramer. Almas Clipper ships, Commander Lieutenant Commander Pavel Alexeyevich Zelenoy. The first to arrive at the port of New York on September 24th, 1863 was the Oslabla frigate under the command of Captain First Rank Butakov. The other ships arrived later, one at a time, because shortly before the end of the passage across the Atlantic they got into a storm. The presence of Russian warships seriously cheered up the supporters of President Lincoln, who by that time was still in a rather difficult position. Interestingly, even then, the British press acted accordingly to all the canons of the informational war, talking about how the Oslabla frigate arrived in New York for the winter solely because it was technically possible to get to Kronstadt. Therefore, they say, the British reasons there is no need to worry at all. Russia is not plotting anything against Great Britain and cannot plot anything. Meanwhile, on October the 1st, 1863, the second Russian squadron sailing across the Pacific Ocean approached San Francisco. The second squadron included the corvettes Bogatyr, Commander Lieutenant Commander Pyotr Afanasyevich Chebyshev, Kalevala, Lieutenant Commander Kornelian Rinda, Lieutenant Commander G.P. Skrylev, Clippers Abreak and Gaidamak. The commander of the second squadron was Rear Admiral Andrei Alexandrovich Popov, a well-known naval commander, commander of the Pacific Squadron and a shipbuilder under whose leadership the famous priests were built. The arrival of Russian ships in San Francisco also turned out to be just in time. The city lived in fear of frigate Alabama, built in Great Britain for Southerners. It was commanded by Raphael Semmes, who gained notoriety for his pirate attacks on the ships of the Northerners. Therefore, a strong Russian squadron was seen as a real gift of fate for the defense of San Francisco from the Alabama. The city authorities turned to Rear Admiral Popov with the question of whether he was ready to use force if Alabama appeared near San Francisco, to which the Russian naval commander answered in the affirmative. However, it was the answer that cost Rear Admiral Popov his position. Russian diplomacy found itself in a very delicate position, since St. Petersburg for a long time officially denied its interference in the internal affairs of the United States. Now it turns out the Russian admiral actually admitted that he had come to the aid of the Northerners against the Southerners. Nevertheless, Popov's response had a somewhat sobering effect on the UK. In London, they thought that there was an agreement on allied relations between St. Petersburg and Washington. Of course, the British did not want to fight on several fronts at once. After all, during the events described, they were fighting in Mexico. Supporting the Southerners by landing troops would inevitably mean, as they believed in London, the beginning of a war not only with the United States but also with Russia. Therefore, we can say that the appearance of Russian ships averted from the United States the danger of an armed conflict with Great Britain and France, which would still be unknown how it would affect the further political fate of the American state. But now, not only the political interests of the Russian Empire were defended by Russian sailors on the distant American coast. On October 23, 1863, a great fire broke out in San Francisco. It was hardly extinguished by the city authorities, and naturally the Russian sailors could not stand aside. Sailors were sent from the ships that were on the road to help the inhabitants of the city. As a result of extinguishing these fires, 6 Russian sailors died and even more sailors received various burns and injuries. The political consequences of the expedition to American shores were colossal. Great Britain, fearing the safety of the Pacific, and Atlantic merchant shipping refused to support France in the event of confrontation with Russia over Poland. Austria, previously also opposed to Russia, changed its position and even helped put down the Polish uprising. Finally, France, left without allies, alone did not dare to start hostilities either against Russia or against the North American states. Russian squadrons were withdrawn from American ports only on July the 20th, 1864, after suppression of the Polish uprising. The mission in the New World was over, but the experience I lost. The political consequences of the expedition to American shores were colossal. Great Britain, fearing the safety of Pacific and Atlantic merchant shipping, refused to support France in the event of confrontation with Russia over Poland. Austria, previously also opposed to Russia, changed its position and even helped put down the Polish uprising. Finally, France, left without allies, alone did not dare to start hostilities either against Russia or against the North American states. Russian squadrons were withdrawn from American ports only on July the 20th, 1864, after the suppression of the Polish uprising. The mission in the New World was over, but the experience in sending Russian ships to American ports was not in vain. In 1876-1877, the second American expedition of the Russian fleet took place. The reason, as for the first time, was the aggravation of relations with Great Britain due to Russia's support of the uprising of the Bulgarian people against the Ottoman Empire. In December 1876, the ships of the Pacific Squadron and the Siberian Flotilla arrived in San Francisco under the command of Rear Admiral Orest Polikarpovich Puzino, and in March 1877 a squadron under the command of Rear Admiral Ivan Butakov arrived in New York. The appearance of squadrons off the coast of the United States again had the same goals: to demonstrate to Great Britain that in the event of hostilities, Russian ships would interfere with British transoceanic trade. When relations with London somewhat normalized, Russia again withdrew its ships from American ports. Interestingly, during the stay of Russian ships in American ports in 1863-1864, the newspapers of the Northerners came out with enthusiastic articles about Russian sailors. The Americans were pleasantly surprised to see educated and well-mannered Russian naval officers, friendly and courageous sailors. President Lincoln himself treated the Russians very favorably. Only later, when the relationship between the Russian Empire and the United States began to deteriorate, American historical science, the point of view prevailed that Russia sending its ships to the American shores was guided solely by its own political goals and was not going to support the Northerners. This is definitely not the case. Of course, St. Petersburg thought about the well-being and interests of Russia in the first place, but the North American states also received very significant support from the imperial fleet. In many ways, it was the presence of the Russian fleet that saved the United States from the risk of attack by the British and French. So let's see the review of the press at the time. God bless the Russians, September 1863, the 23rd to the 26th. God bless the Russian, Gideon Wallace. Russian warships arrive in New York City, sent by the Tsar in order to be sure that the Imperial Russian fleet is not icebound in the event of war against England and France over the Polish question. The move is praised by Secretary of the Navy Gideon Wallace and the New York Times. September 24th, Thursday, New York City. Several Russian warships arrive on a friendly visit. Today, New York Times reports that the Russian frigate Oslabya, which has lain at anchor in our harbor for several days past and has been an object of so much interest to our citizens, is about to be reinforced by a fleet of 4 or 5 vessels of the same nationality. The English steamer which arrived yesterday reports having signaled the fleet a short distance outside of Sandy Hook. On paying a visit to Oslabla yesterday, we found her officers in the best of spirit at the prospect of soon being joined by so large a force of their countrymen with whom they can share the pleasures of their visit here. An admiral of the Russian Navy accompanies the fleet, but his name or the names of the vessels composing the fleet are not known on board of the Oslabla. The Oslabla has been absent from Russia for 2 years and came to this port from Cadiz, Spain. She is here awaiting order and will probably join the fleet on its departure from this port. Those who have been on board of her all speak in the highest terms of her appearance and management, and of the rare intelligence and gentlemanly bearing of her officers of every grade. We were told by the courteous midshipman who escorted us throughout the frigate that the officers belonging to the Russian Navy are required to be able to speak English and French. There were none on board the Slaba who would not speak the former language correctly and fluently. Last night the vessels spoken of above as signaled, and which proved to be a steam frigate arriving at an anchor in Flushing Bay. September 25th, Friday, Washington, D.C. The English government has interposed to prevent the armored rams built by the Lairds from coming out. Things look a little threatening from France, but Louis Napoleon may not persist when he learns that England has changed her policy. Should we meet with defeat at Chattanooga, it is by no means certain England will not again assume unfriendly airs and refer the question of the departure of the armored ships to the law officers of the Crown. Our own ironclads and the fear of privateers which would ruin her commerce are, however, the best law and our best safeguards. The Russian fleet has come out of the Baltic and are now in New York, or a large number of the vessels have arrived. They are not to be confined in the Baltic by a northern winter. In sending them to this country at this time there is something significant. What will be its effect on France and the French policy we shall learn in due time. It may moderate, it may exacerbate. God bless the Russians. Gideon Wallace, in his direct comments on international relations.